to interpret Jesus as being white when essentially white Christianity is racially, is historically false and theologically absurd, and practically, in terms of its effect on black people, it's a debasing institution that enslaves black people. I think we have to understand, though, that we're not making moral judgments here. Any institution that exists in any society exists to serve the interests of the people who set it up. And Christianity began as a black man's religion. It's an African religion.
There is no such thing as a race. Nature created no races. Man created races, racial classifications, and he had his own reason for doing it. Now, who benefited from this artificial creation at first? Who benefits from it now? Racism was created to justify the slave trade, to justify the colonial system, and to justify the utter ruthlessness that had to go into the making of modern capitalism.
For some time now, we have had history of Christianity being told in different perspectives. We have had a section of people trying to say that Christianity originated from Africa and it is a black religion. There are those who hold the view that Christianity was a white man's religion and therefore Africa has nothing to do with it. Is this the truth? I came across a clip here that I think is very, very important for us to listen to. It is highlighting some of the most important issues that really touch on early Christianity and how blacks and whites coexisted at the inception of what we know as Christianity today. So let's watch this, then come back and share our thoughts together.
There is no such thing as a race. Nature created no races. Man created races, racial classifications, and he had his own reason for doing it. Now, who benefited from this artificial creation at first? Who benefits from it now? Now, let's look at the historical roots of this whole thing, and you're not going to understand it until you understand the implications, the far-reaching effects of the opening up of the so-called New World, Christopher Columbus and other thugs coming, suppressing the Indians, and finding a justification for this kind of thing. Let's look at Europe in the 15th and the 16th century. Because racism has its roots in that second rise of Europe in the 15th and the 16th century. They had to justify what they were going to do to most of mankind. They were about to take over the whole world. Now, there's a myth about an argument about whether the world was round or flat. That's an old wives' tale. The European had gained enough knowledge and had enough guns, and he had been hungry enough within the body of Europe until he decided that he was going to go out and take the world, be it round or flat. Now, in order to understand the religious basis of racism, we have to go back to a papal bull that the Pope issued in 1455 in an argument between Portugal and Spain. He turned to them impatiently and said, "You are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people." And it just so happens that most of the so-called infidels were non-European people, non-white people. Europe not only had its basis for racism, it had its basis for the slave trade, and this same basis would be good in the colonial system that followed. Racism was created to justify the slave trade, to justify the colonial system, and to justify the utter ruthlessness that had to go into the making of modern capitalism.
Brother Wilcox?
Let me begin by suggesting that the clearest evidence of racism in education is the essential control over black education, both in so-called integrated settings and in segregated settings, by white people, many of whom are incapable of responding to the people they're educating as people, many of whom are incapable of understanding the culture and the history of the people they're educating, many of whom really do not see any kind of responsibility for involving these communities and managing their own education. The second kind of aspect is the ability of white communities to keep black people out of their communities and still yet exercise some influence over the education in black communities. That is, even when there's no blacks in the white community, whites are still having some kind of influence over the education in black communities. A third example is the way in which our schools are organized. Despite the fact that we know we live in a racist society, the schools continue to be organized as though racism does not exist. That is, there's been no real shift of power within the school. There's been no effective change in the content. There's been no forthright recognition of the politics involved in education. For instance, in New York City, about 55% of the students are black and Puerto Rican, yet we have one black and one Puerto Rican member on a school board of 5 people. So 3 white people are making decisions that affect 55% of people whom they may not be able to respect as people.
Reverend Clegg?
Well, I think the basic reason or symptom or proof for the racism of the Christian church is the simple fact that white people have pretended for so long that Jesus was white, and that they've had the necessity to interpret Jesus as being white, when essentially white Christianity is racially, is historically false and theologically absurd, and practically, in terms of its effect on black people, it's a debasing institution that enslaves black people. I think we have to understand, though, that we're not making moral judgments here. Any institution that exists in any society exists to serve the interests of the people who set it up. And Christianity began as a black man's religion. It's an African religion. We have to remember that Israel went into Egypt with 70 people, and after approximately 750 years came out with over 2 million people, and hordes of other slaves who came out and became also part of the emerging new nation of Israel. So Israel, the biblical Israel, was a black nation, an African nation that came out of Africa and kept constant ties with Africa. And so we have to remember then that Jesus was a black Messiah, not a white Messiah, and he comes out of the whole historical background of Africa, of African traditions, of African history, of African culture, the concept of communalism, the concept of a chosen people, the concept of kingdom of God on earth. All these things were out of African tradition, not out of the white man's tradition. And Jesus was essentially a revolutionary Messiah who was trying to lead a black people in a revolt, in a struggle and conflict with a white Gentile oppressor. So the whole church has to be viewed from the point of view of the white oppressor. The white oppressor has one kind of Christianity, has one kind of church. The black church has to become independent and go back to the historic African roots of Christianity, because the slave church that the white man set up for black people tends to continue the enslavement of black people. So the black church has to become, again, a revolutionary instrument in the hands of black people, controlled by black people, fighting, as Jesus fought, for the liberation of black people against white Gentile oppression.
I'd like to continue from Reverend Clegg's point and deal briefly with image, because image